Welcome to Accelerated. I'm your host, Vitaly Golomb. On this second season of the podcast, we are hearing from some of the global leaders in everything electric and autonomous, moving us quickly into the future. On this episode, we speak with Vlad Voroninski, co-founder and CEO of Helm.ai, the android of autonomous vehicles. Vlad is an applied mathematician, an AI researcher, and entrepreneur with many years of R&D experience in algorithmic development. His PhD thesis in mathematics at UC Berkeley made fundamental contributions to phase retrieval and quantum tomography, for which he was awarded the Bernhard Friedman Memorial Prize in 2013 and the SIAM Outstanding Paper Prize in 2014. Previously, he was a postdoc fellow at MIT and a PhD and Postdoc at UC Berkeley. Vlad served as a chief scientist at Sift Security, acquired by Netskope, before co-founding Helm.ai. We got into some really fascinating topics around autonomous vehicles. Here's our conversation with Vlad. Vlad, thank you very much for being on Accelerated. It's a pleasure to have you, a real expert on artificial intelligence and the autonomous world, a very hot topic. So we'll dive right in. So before you became an entrepreneur, you were an academic. What inspired you to get into research, and how did you make the transition to business?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Vitaly. So interestingly enough, my earliest research passion was actually autonomous driving. So I was already leaning in a scientific direction in early undergrad, but I was mostly absorbing a lot of different fields. Started out as a cybernetics major, which is essentially the application of control theory to biology in a fairly broad sense. And I was walking down the hall one day and saw a flyer for the UCLA Vision Lab, which was run by my undergrad advisor, Stefano Soato. And it talked about autonomous vehicles as an application of cybernetics. And I just thought it was the coolest thing, automating a machine to be able to perform a pretty complex task like driving. So, I emailed Stefano that same day and ended up enrolling in a grad course he was teaching on computer vision. I was completely unprepared for that grad course, but, didn't have the basic background for it, but somehow got through it and ended up joining the UCLA Vision Lab, which was at the time participating in the DARPA Grand Challenges. Learned quite a lot there, and the most interesting part is actually the role of applied mathematics and computer vision AI. That seemed like the real bottleneck, and so I actually ended up switching my major to math in my last year of undergrad, and kind of went super deep into that, and saw it have a really big impact on my ability to do research in computer vision. And at that point, I kind of discovered I had a natural talent for math, and kind of got hooked, and kept saying to myself, okay, I'll do math for a couple more years and then come back to computer vision. But ended up going much further into the math world than I expected, and even kind of considered seriously being a mathematician. But ultimately, I knew that what I really wanted to do was start a company and really build something that works in the real world. And so as far as transitioning to business, I kind of knew I wanted to start a company since I was about 20 years old, and kept thinking I would drop out of school at some point to do that. It just kind of took a lot longer than expected. And in fact, I really wanted to work on self-driving cars, but it was too early for that for many years. Kind of always had a thought process running in the background about various business models. Not necessarily related to that. Like at some point, got really excited about things like mutually assured contracts, like Kickstarter, and it was fun to observe from the side how those things panned out. And with various technologies, I always was looking for an angle to turn them into products. Kind of dabbled in various startup ideas for a few years, often involving computer vision applications, but my academic career had taken on a life of its own, and those initial startup ideas weren't quite compelling enough. So, eventually during my postdoc, I finally made the leap with a company called Sift Security, where I was co-founding chief scientist. And Sift focused on cybersecurity for the cloud, and I built out their ML pipeline. So that was a very formative experience, and kind of seeing like nothing become something, and certainly informed me quite a bit about starting Helmai.
Now, for our audience, it seems like a lot of the the autonomous projects and a lot of the autonomous teams go way back to those DARPA challenges. Can you talk for a minute about what those DARPA challenges were and how that worked?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the DARPA grant challenges essentially were, a competition sponsored by the government to deploy autonomous cars in fairly controlled environments. At least that's how it started out, where essentially the teams had quite a lot of information about what the eventual task was. And so there was kind of a lot of effort leading up to that one event. What's interesting about it is that I think, we have to give it credit for really giving rise to like the interest in self-driving cars, and almost like, giving birth to that industry. But in a lot of ways, I think that it was potentially actually detrimental to the evolution of the space because, essentially, autonomous driving is actually like the opposite of that, right? It's the opposite of knowing exactly what you're up against on one particular day, right? And the thing is, computer vision technology was actually very, very raw at that point. Like it actually barely played a role in the DARPA grant challenges. It was primarily like LiDAR driven, and the winning teams had quite a lot of LiDAR technology on their stacks, and I think in a lot of ways it was more about actuation and sensor calibration, getting all those things to work as opposed to the actual AI technology deployed. And so I think that the teams that kind of became anointed as kind of the experts in the space, surely we must give them credit for that, but I think that the AI component was almost entirely missing at that stage. But I think it, gave a lot of excitement to self-driving cars and did eventually kind of like end up where we are today. But I think it's really important to point out the fact that the thing that's the core bottleneck today really was entirely unaddressed by DARPA grant challenges, but nevertheless was like a very, informative kind of competition that really kind of gave rise to the space.
Yeah, I know a number of other teams that are working in autonomy all came through that pipeline, but it's interesting thought that, it was all kind of obstacle avoidance rather than looking at those kind of edge cases, which are now the issue that all the autonomous companies are trying to deal with. So let's talk about Helm.ai. Can you give us a quick history on the company and what your mission is?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, at the end of my postdoc at MIT, I was kind of interviewing for professorships in academia, really entertaining that route. But it became clear to me that I didn't really want to do that, and I think it was clear to the people I was interviewing with as well. At the same time, like the thing that was really notable about around that time, 2015, 2016, was that becoming very clear that deep learning was going to be a key technology within AI, and I was really impressed with the potential of it. And I already knew at that point I wanted to dedicate my career to AI, just a matter of kind of figuring out exactly what to do. So, I was working on a number of computer vision projects at the time, and they were kind of becoming increasingly more applied. And, what really stood out to me was that there was kind of fundamental perception problem for robotics that needed to be addressed for kind of the transition of AI from being a purely digital thing to something that interacts with physical environments. So I got very, compelled by that problem. And, in parallel, I was, already anticipating that I would start a company. I'd been looking for a co-founder, and through some connections at MIT, met my co-founder and CTO of Helm.ai, Tudor Akim. And, it's just like really one of the brightest people I've met in Silicon Valley. And, he was, really, really good at software and AI, and also able to, absorb, really difficult math papers that I sent to him. And we were just kind of geek out about various AI topics. And, the kind of self-driving space was kind of at a fever pitch in 2016. And so it was very clear that there was an opportunity to build a lot of value, right? In particular, like when Cruise got acquired by GM, that was like pretty striking. I had a pretty good sense of kind of what they had at the time, and, I was very confident we can do a lot better than that with a different approach. So, decided to pull the trigger and teamed up with Tudor to co-found Helm, and, he dropped out of Stanford to join me within a couple of weeks after I started talking about it. And, we spent a couple of months building the initial prototypes, and once those came to fruition, kind of formally started the company and raised funding. And the mission of Helm is really, we're an AI software automation company. We're focusing on self-driving cars, but really the vision is about robotics at large. So over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a number of industries mature where AI really will start to automate physical things, and we want to play a role in all those various industries.
And there are obviously a number of companies attacking different angles and different approaches on autonomy. What's novel about Helm's approach?
So to first kind of discuss what are the things you actually need to get to full autonomy, right? So I think you need three things. You need highly scalable AI technology. You also need the ability to do large-scale validation, and you also need a source of capital that isn't just at the whim of kind of public or private markets due to some level of uncertainty in the kind of rollout timelines and regulation. And our approach is really kind of differentiated along all three of those dimensions. So first on the technology side, it was very clear to us from the beginning, back in 2016, that traditional deep learning just would never achieve fully self-driving cars. Essentially to solve autonomous driving, you basically need to solve computer vision. It's not enough to simply rely on other sensors like radar or LiDAR to address the most difficult corner cases. And computer vision is a very hard problem, right? So, 70% of your brain is fully dedicated to vision at any given point in time. And, your brain's been optimized through quite a lot of evolution, right? And, traditional deep learning relies on providing examples of the task being performed. So if you want to really understand a given image, you need to understand every single pixel as well as the depth, at every single pixel. And it's just incredibly expensive to generate that kind of data for computer vision tasks. And if you want to get to human level accuracy with that, it might be required for you to train maybe, trillions of images. Meanwhile, annotation can cost a few dollars per image, right? So it's just a very simple napkin calculation can tell you that traditional deep learning will never solve self-driving cars, right? And so in 2016, that's kind of all that was really available. And so we knew that we needed to do a lot better than that to achieve a winning position in the space. And so that's why we focused so much on unsupervised learning and invented a technology we call deep teaching, which leverages insights from cutting-edge applied mathematics and compressive sensing to replace the need for annotation with certain mathematical modeling techniques. And once these kinds of pipelines are in place, they just don't require any annotation, which makes them arbitrarily scalable. So the cost of computation, is orders of magnitude cheaper than annotation. So essentially, we're able to get to whatever level of accuracy that we want on a much more capital efficient route. And unsupervised learning is a very hard problem, right? It's much easier said than done, and I think we've innovated in that area more than any other company in the space. It's really kind of our secret weapon, where all of our technology advantages come from. And there are two other aspects that are important. Basically there's large scale validation, right? And there's just kind of having a good source of capital, right? So importantly, we go after high-end ADAS. So we essentially license our software for volume production programs for L2 plus systems and above. And what that gets us is access to large-scale fleets without putting up the capital for actually deploying those cars, right? Which could be potentially millions of cars. And this is very important because, this is in contrast to kind of the straight to L4 approaches, which try to solve kind of a tiny sliver of the problem at any given cost. That only gets you so far, right? I mean, driving in Phoenix, Arizona is, potentially 100 times easier than driving in San Francisco. So even if you solve Phoenix, Arizona, doesn't really mean much. And, scaling a fleet to be big enough to actually validate L4, you might need to get to maybe millions of cars, and nobody has the capital to be able to do that without tying into a business model like selling cars. And so that's why we think that, going after partial autonomy first and tackling the scale part of the problem first is of paramount importance, because it gives us access to much larger scales of validation. And lastly, essentially, by going after the high-end ADAS market, we go after an existing market, so we can actually generate revenue today and build an independent business that allows us to kind of reinvest the revenues from that into L4 R&D. It's kind of a natural path toward getting to full autonomy, kind of a product evolution towards solving a really hard problem. And I can see why it might be attractive to others to think like, hey, let's just do this all ourselves and build up our own fleet and be in full control of our destiny. But the reality is that what you end up with is kind of being in full control of a science project, and you don't actually have enough capital for it to become a business that way.
So it's interesting. Let me summarize. I think you're talking about building kind of a Trojan horse of where, on the one hand, you're giving the big automakers what they want and can't develop in-house, which is very advanced assistive driving systems. That's maybe level 2.9 in autonomy speak, and that gives you the volume of data that you're collecting to then eventually roll out level 4, level 5 true autonomy. So it's quite interesting where other companies are really trying to deploy their own fleets and get that data on their own. You're able to get there in a different path, and that's worth recognizing, because that's quite unique. I'm really excited to share something a long time in the making with you. My first online course. Over the years, I've trained thousands of founders through my book, Accelerated Startup, and my infamous Pitching Like a Boss workshops and keynotes. Like I've done for thousands of founders, I will teach you how to pitch like a boss. And for the first time ever, I will be doing it in a cohort-based online course. This is the world's most comprehensive and intensive course for entrepreneurs and future founders on pitching. It will help you craft the perfect pitch for investors and customers. It will also help you master public speaking. Get funded, communicate your vision to grow your team, and dramatically improve sales of any product. Check out golomb.net/pitching, that's golomb.net/pitching for more information. See you there. Now, there are a lot of breakthroughs. Like every big breakthrough, or big change in technology, people tend to wildly underestimate how long that rollout or that takeoff period is going to take for that, to use AI nomenclature, the takeoff period to get to what the promise is. And we've been promised for many years now that full autonomy is just around the corner, and we know that we've been disappointed by some of these statements. What are your thoughts? How long do you think it will really take us to get to level 4 or 5 autonomy? Level 4 being most cases, level 5 being no steering controls whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of note, right, in terms of making these projections, right, back in 2016, I think there were a lot of claims about getting to full autonomy by 2018 or 2020, and I was extremely skeptical of those claims on a purely technological basis. But I do think things are looking different now. And so essentially, but I think it depends quite a lot on the approach, right, which is kind of goes back to emphasize the previous point. I think that at least for Helmai, let's say, I think technologically, with enough capital, which primarily would be dedicated to offline compute and to some degree validation, an approach like deep teaching can achieve L4 readiness within a few years. So we have the ability to get arbitrary accuracy for any given computer vision problem. And there are various other innovations that make it possible to be robust to out of distribution corner cases. The main bottleneck on the inference side is like just the compute budget, because the DNNs have to become a lot bigger to enable human level accuracy. But compute platforms are getting very powerful, and so they'll get there in a few years. But once the technology is built, it does need to be significantly validated to actually roll it out. And that's where I think these large-scale consumer fleets will be critical. Since one can get an actual kind of strong statistical sense of the level of safety without, putting up the capital to have a bunch of, say like robo-taxis rolling around San Francisco. So, I think that, I think in a few years, technologically speaking, L4 is like definitely possible, but I think validating it and, having it pass regulations is kind of a really important part of the equation as well. And so, kind of way I think about it is that there are a lot of approaches out there that are kind of these, straight tail for LiDAR-centric approaches that are still kind of predominant. And, I just don't know if they'll get there at all, because computer vision is really at the heart of autonomous driving. And that's really the thing that's, preventing from the technology from fully working yet. That being said, of course, not to say that LiDAR is not an important sensor. Like, it is important, but it's not the key enabler of L4, but more of a redundancy mechanism, right? I mean, for example, within a few years, if you have enough, real-time compute, and be able to run these very deep nets, and if you have a few cameras, you'll be able to get highly accurate depth measurements, just like LiDAR, except you'll have actually better resolution and better range. So for depth prediction, it'll be more of a cost question. For a given resolution and range, is it cheaper to buy a bunch of LiDARs or to just use a lot of compute and a bunch of cameras? But for other aspects of the problem, like semantic understanding, that'll still be primarily computer vision based. Again, going straight for L4 might not really even pan out because you just can't get sufficient scale to really validate that what you're doing is safe enough. So, assuming the approach leverages kind of these like large scale, consumer fleets, I think that in a few years, L4 is certainly possible.
That's great. No, that's great to hear. That's a relief that we're actually getting there. Now, when we do get there, what do you think will be the first vehicles, on the road, off-road? Where do you think we're going to see true autonomy first?
I guess I'd like to maybe define true autonomy, if I may. I think that whenever we talk about autonomous cars, I think it's important, or vehicles, it's important to bake into the definition that they are deployed at scale, that they are cost effective, right? Because if that isn't the case, it's really unclear if that's really relevant, right? I mean, if it's just a matter of making a few vehicles fully autonomous and releasing them into a highly controlled environment, that's dramatically easier than launching at scale, right? Because even from like a liability perspective, and the operational domain perspective, essentially, assuming that each vehicle, let's say, has the same level of risk, your overall liability risk scales with the size of the fleet, right? So you can play a game of probabilities to launch something that's self-driving, but at a small scale, and its risk profile might be okay at that scale, but that fleet might not be safe enough to actually deploy, worldwide, let's say, right? And also, if it's not actually cost effective, it also doesn't really make sense to deploy at scale. I mean, if it's going to be highly unprofitable. So I think to answer the kind of like what I think is the more important question of when will we see self-driving vehicles at scale in a cost-effective manner, I think we'll first see them as L4 capable L2 systems, potentially on consumer highway pilot system products, right? So consumer fleets, with kind of highly advanced ADAS on them. And so, technologically, it should be possible within a few years to have these kinds of vehicles that are out there that are safer than a human driver. It doesn't mean that people will be able to kind of sleep in the back seat right away, right? They'll still have to be kind of operating the vehicle just to make sure to be able to take over. But that's really more of a validation step, right? I mean, so the distinction between L2 and L4 is really that of liability, right? So you can have something that's actually in effect safer than a human driver, but because it hasn't yet been validated and because maybe the OEM doesn't want to take full liability yet, it's still characterized as an L2 system. But eventually, after you see enough miles, you can get confidence that's actually safer than a human driver. And so if you take, so I think that's where we'll see maybe the first real L4 systems. And then, taking the lessons and validation from those types of at-volume consumer fleets, it'll be possible to launch, highway trucking solutions, urban delivery, L4 solutions, and, urban robotaxi might be the last one to get solved just because it's kind of a more complex environment with, relatively high speeds, and it has kind of a more fussy cargo, right, a human. So, but yeah, that's the kind of roadmap that I envision.
Well, yeah, I mean that's very insightful. Let me combine a couple of questions that are always kind of interesting here. on the one hand, there's an argument that when we do have true passenger vehicle autonomy, fewer people are going to be buying and owning vehicles because they are all they're looking for is to get a ride, and it may be cheaper than an Uber. That whole equation changes, especially for people in the city that live in the cities. On the other hand, we tend to drive all about the same time. We drive in the morning to and from work. We drive in the late afternoon, to and from work. So that's kind of a tricky one. So your thoughts on personal car ownership, and then also there's an ethics debate about this whole trolley problem always gets brought up. If there's an automated automated trolley that has to decide, is it going to kill 2 pedestrians or 1 pedestrian? How does it make that choice? So car ownership and the trolley problem. What are your thoughts?
Sure, those are great questions. Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as like car ownership goes, I think that let's say that we're living in a world where you can buy, a fully self-driving car, which in theory can be farmed out as a robo-taxi. I think kind of brings up the question of like, is the value of that fact built into the vehicle price, right? Or is it something like, let's say, Volkswagen has talked about, charging on an hourly basis for autonomous driving capability for consumer cars. The question is is the reason for that to incentivize people to farm out their cars as robo-taxis, right? And so, what if the person, buys the car but then never actually uses that feature, right? So I think it'll kind of depend. I mean, I think there will certainly always be a segment of the population that will just like want their own car and not want to share with others. So if they're buying an autonomous car, they're effectively, buying a private AI driver, assuming they can afford it. And another segment will be, content potentially just taking autonomous taxis everywhere, kind of if the price is right, or maybe, buying a car that's autonomous and kind of letting it do its thing while they're at work or something like that. And, we're certainly already seeing people kind of transition with respect to car ownership and, to some extent just like take Ubers and maybe forego buying a car. But, there are other issues there, like, how long do you have to wait for an Uber, right? I mean, it's nice to be driven around, but if you have to wait 20 minutes just to get the Uber, that can be kind of annoying. So it'll be a volume question of how available these vehicles are on demand. And I think also it'll come down to how the OEMs decide to monetize the self-driving capability. So yeah, I think it's kind of an open question, but interesting one for sure. And regarding the trolley problem, is it kind of a real problem? I think that, yeah, sure, it's a real problem, and I think that it's as real for machines as it is for humans. Humans have kind of a built-in moral compass, but these things aren't objective, right? Hence why we have philosophical debates about it. And so I think it'll be kind of up to us to encode machines with some notion of morality. Maybe even one day, perhaps once the machines are advanced enough, they can come up with an even better moral framework than humans have. But, that's probably going to happen after we have self-driving cars. But, from a practical perspective, I think it'll come down to a mix of kind of government regulation and liability law in terms of how issues like the trolley problem would be handled by an autonomous vehicle. But from an AI perspective, it's there's no issue essentially in toggling whatever kind of behavior you might want. It's really going to be a question that society will have to kind of deal with what do we want to imbue as far as the behavior goes for these autonomous cars.
Yeah, so it's kind of a moot point with this trolley problem. I guess the other solution I heard the other day is that the trolley will just stop. It won't have to kill 1 or 2 pedestrians.
Well, that's wishful thinking, right? That's not always going to be possible. The point of the trolley problem is that you only have 2 choices, so that's kind of a cop-out. But sure.
When companies start to catch fire on blitzscale and look for capital to fuel that growth, or look to find the right exit strategy, they often seek the counsel of investment bankers. At Drakestar Partners, we work with some of the leading companies in global tech on capital raises, M&A, corporate carve-outs, SPACs, and much more. And we're pretty good at it. Our team of over 100 technology sector experts across 9 offices in 6 countries is comprised of not only career bankers, but experienced executive venture investors and technologists. Drakestar Partners is the #1 ranked and fastest growing mid-market investment bank across the US and Europe. While I focus on mobility and energy transition sector, along with all things Silicon Valley, my partners from the Pacific to the Atlantic and around the world lead in software, media, communications, and everything in between. Learn more about us at drakestar.com. So speaking of liability, there's a very low tolerance for these early autonomous accidents, and as we get more autonomous vehicles, or more autonomous in nature, we'll have a temporary increase in accidents. And how do you think regulators and general public will react to this fact? And how do we get through this? Because ultimately, these vehicles will be safer, but there's got to be some period where there will be an increase in accidents.
Well, to be honest with you, I actually don't know if I think that that's necessarily true, right? Like, I think that it's not an inevitability that there will be an increase in accidents. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think that if there is an increase in accidents with a whole lot of self-driving cars, then something is going wrong, and perhaps it shouldn't be rolled out that way. Self-driving cars are perfectly capable, will eventually be perfectly capable of judging how, their presence and their actions will impact the actions of human drivers. In particular, they'll be able to, capable of mimicking human driving behavior quite well, such that, if you didn't, as long as you can't tell that there's actually nobody in that car, you might just think it's another human driving, right? And in particular, of course, the AI systems will want to emulate just the good parts of, human driving, right? Like, not the lack of attention or the fatigue or the aggression aspects, but, some highly attentive human driver, right? So, I don't actually think that, I think that there would be something wrong with a rollout plan that increases accidents.
Well, let me clarify. What I mean is that right now there have been a handful of accidents related to autonomous vehicles of different sorts, and there's been a lot of news coverage of each one of them. So as we roll out and we have hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands, even if the occurrence is very, very low percentage, a fraction of it, the tolerance of the general public towards autonomous vehicles causing fatalities or accidents otherwise is probably 3 orders of magnitude lower than the tolerance that we built up to just knowing that there's human drivers that are not very good out there that are causing accidents. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that we should decouple sort of the statistical safety of self-driving cars versus, media coverage and the optics around that and the public reaction. Those are different things. But I think that actually, as to your point, this is another reason why I think that launching these L2 systems at scale is such a good approach, because it essentially allows humans to become much more comfortable with the notion of a self-driving car, while the human still has the control to turn it off as needed and still is ultimately responsible for what happens, right? So I think that, that's actually, I think that it has a much better chance of working well. I think a human driver combined with a properly designed, high-end ADAS system that has the ability to actually check if a human's paying attention, et cetera, those two things combined should be better than just either system alone, and should be safer even than a human driver, right? And so while you're in that regime, the consumer kind of gets used to the notion of an AI system driving the car. They also benefit from increased levels of safety. And the AI system benefits from kind of the large-scale validation that you get on these kind of large-scale consumer fleets. And the thing about these kinds of ADAS features, they're actually highly sticky. If you ever use them, for example, I have a rear-facing camera in my car, and having used it to kind of back out of parking lots and stuff like that. If I get into a car that doesn't have it, I almost feel blind. I'm like, oh my God, how did I used to do this? So I think that people, most people will definitely kind of adopt the technology and get really comfortable with it, and provided that we can actually show at scale that it's safer than human driving, it shouldn't be an issue to kind of transition to that, in a bigger way. But, I think that's the optimal path. I think that the things that have occurred, with various, I don't want to name any specifics, but, yeah, I think there's been some pretty unfortunate stuff with the rollout of self-driving cars, and frankly, I think it was irresponsible. So I think that it should not be an inevitable fact that there's somehow going to be an increase in accidents as we roll this technology.
That's a very positive approach. I like that. Yeah, and I think your solution is very sound as far as kind of gradually getting people used to it. It'll take some time, but it's better measure twice and cut once, so to say. What are the biggest misconceptions from your perspective about autonomy out there?
Okay, so yeah, where do I begin? So I think there's a number of these. I'll name a few. I think that maybe an easy one is kind of this never-ending debate about, LiDAR versus vision. I think that it shouldn't really be like that. It sounds kind of very adversarial. But I think there's kind of like, a lot of money at stake when it comes to the LiDAR industry, lots of vested interest. But, I think that it is an important point, though, that, LiDAR alone is not going to be the thing that really enables autonomous driving. If I gave you kind of, proof by example, or if I gave you like an augmented reality headset and projected a bunch of LiDAR point clouds into your visual field and, blocked the rest of your vision and asked you to drive based on that, like you'd be pretty horrified. It'd be very, very difficult. It's pretty rare for a human to not process pretty much exactly what's happening on the road, right? And it can be pretty frightening if you can't quite understand what's going on because it's so dangerous, right? And so imagine, having to drive in a constant state of panic because you don't actually quite understand what's going on around you. And that's pretty much what you would get if you were only using LiDAR. And again, I'm not against LiDAR at all. I think it's an amazing technology and can be a great source of redundancy for L4 systems, but it's just not sufficient on its own. While computer vision technically could be, right? Humans drive based on vision alone, and once we have more compute and better neural networks, it'll definitely be possible. So I think there's a bit of misconception when it comes to that, just because there's so much kind of vested interest in the various marketing efforts. I think another thing is misconception is that it kind of seems to be the notion that somehow this like self-driving race is like already like really, really mature. But I think companies tend to get judged by kind of like how much capital they've raised, and if some company has raised more money, they're automatically ahead. This is like quite false. We've gone kind of toe to toe with some very highly capitalized companies and have come out ahead as far as our technology goes. And I think what really matters is kind of the scalability of your approach, of your AI software, of your validation strategy. How much accuracy and how many features can you create per dollar? And the difference between traditional deep learning and unsupervised deep teaching is like literally orders of magnitude. So it's a pretty cool thing. Kind of like a good example is kind of like the Human Genome Project, right? Originally was just like a huge effort, kind of very expensive, just to kind of sequence one human genome, whereas like now we can do it for several orders of magnitude cheaper. And AI is like a very nascent space, and there's some pretty surprising stuff you can do with it with the right approach. So from where I sit, this kind of like race to create the first fully autonomous vehicle is pretty much wide open, despite quite a lot of capital that's already been deployed. And there are kind of outstanding technical challenges and validation challenges that need to be addressed, and they just can't simply be overpowered with capital on both accounts, right? You can't overpower deep learning simply with annotation, and you can't actually deploy enough capital to achieve sufficient scale, of validation without a business model like selling cars, right? So the approach really matters a lot, and I think that sometimes tends to get kind of swept under the rug in certain conversations.
That's very interesting. And your thoughts when you mentioned that the original idea behind Helm is not just autonomous vehicles, but kind of applying the robotics problem to autonomous vehicles. What are your thoughts on delivery drones, air taxis, things up in the air that will be autonomous, but not quite on the road anymore?
Yeah, definitely important areas. We've definitely looked a lot into the drone space, and personally, I think it could be pretty huge as a market. We're actually already working with some drone companies, and do believe that autonomous drones can become widespread in the coming years. And so there's some interesting aspects to drone delivery, like kind of the ability to, for example, get something delivered kind of very quickly, more quickly than potentially other methods. But there's also like other challenges, like, drones generating a lot of noise, or, kind of being a nuisance in certain urban environments. Those are kind of still like open questions. And, one other interesting thing about drones is that it's, there's already autonomous drone fleets, right? But they're kind of regulation dependent, and with the US being kind of more heavily regulated. And, I think where AI technology will play kind of a big role is not just increasing the level of safety for drone fleets, but also kind of giving drones the ability to kind of land or deliver into like more complex environments. And it's definitely a problem that starts to overlap a little bit maybe with self-driving cars when you start dealing with these more urban areas. And, things like air taxis, I think they're kind of like further out, but we're certainly keeping an eye on those markets. And, overall, I'm pretty bullish about, aviation, intersection of aviation, AI, for sure. But there are a number of emerging markets that are important to Helm.ai, including aviation, but also things like consumer robotics, kind of construction, mining, and factory automation. So we're kind of keeping a close eye on all these different markets. And, as they mature, we'll definitely be playing a bigger role in those.
Yeah, it's interesting that you think about the problem of automating in the factory kind of from the same lens as automating a vehicle going down the road or something moving in 3D in the air. That's great. So just to wrap it up, knowing what you know now, do you enjoy entrepreneurship more than research? Would you give yourself advice to make that transition sooner than you did, or is it more challenging in ways that you're not enjoying?
That's a very good question. I think that, as far as like giving myself advice on what to do, if I were to look back, I actually think that I made a transition to entrepreneurship at kind of an optimal time. That was lucky for me, both because I was at this stage where I was like, a fully independent scientist that could, essentially, create my own research program without any additional help from the academic community or anything like that. And it happened to be in a very kind of critical time period for AI. But, I think that really deep tech entrepreneurship is kind of a superset of research, right? So, I deeply enjoy research, but with research alone, there's kind of always kind of a so what aspect to it that wasn't quite enough for me. That was the major challenge, I think, with being an academic, that you're always, wondering so what. And the thing is, when I was in academia, I actually only spent about a third of my time, I think, doing research. The rest of the time I spent, doing various like ML and computer science projects or like learning random other things. And, with research, I think it's kind of like research in isolation, I do think is like easier than entrepreneurship in the sense that all you need to do, at least with kind of theoretical and to some extent certain applied research, is just like write a paper and create a demo, and then you're basically done once you release it into the world. You, of course, still have to market the work, but there isn't kind of, you can just release that information and you don't have to worry about, other aspects, right, as much. And so, whereas like with entrepreneurship, you can build the world's best technology, but that's really just the beginning. You have to productize it, you have to market it, you have to sell it. And, at the end of the day, that's really what I enjoy the most. It's kind of like turning world-class R&D into something that really works as a product that a lot of people can use, and hopefully something that's good for the world, and that, it can save lives and make people's lives easier. And so, given how broad the requirements are for entrepreneurship, I definitely say I enjoy it more than just doing research. It's pretty much impossible to be bored, and research can still play an important role in it.
That was our conversation with Vlad Voroninski, co-founder and CEO of Helm.ai. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give us 5 stars in your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. See you in the next one, and in the meantime, you can always find me at golomb.net.